Shop Talks on Economics. By Mary E. Marcy. 1. What you sell to the boss. If you are a working man or woman, no matter what you do in the shop or factory, or mine, you know that there are two kinds of power used in the plant: human, or labor power, and steam, or water, or perhaps gas explosion, power. The owner of a new barrel mill in Indiana decided it would be cheaper to have some company furnish power to run his mill than to install a power plant himself, so he sent for the 3 representatives of the 3 power plants in that city. The first man came from the company that offered to run the machines in the mill by steam power, the second came from a firm which wanted to sell him a gasoline engine to furnish the power by the explosions of gas, while the third came from a great water power company. This man offered to supply power to run the mill machinery at a lower price than the others asked. Of course, he secured the contract. By this time the mill owner was almost ready to have his plant opened. He had logs, or raw material, ready to start on, he had machinery and power to run that machinery. Only one thing more was needed to start the plant running and to produce staves and hoops for barrels. This was the commodity which you workers supply. It is human power, human labor power. 100 years ago almost everything was produced by human labor power, but gradually improved machinery has been invented that lessens the human toil needed to make things. Big machines, run by steam, or water power, now do most of the heavy and difficult work. But the owner of the mine or factory or mill needs one other commodity to guide the machines, to tend the machines and feed them. He needs your labor power. The barrel manufacturer in Indiana said he needed hands. He meant hands to do things. He meant labor power. So he put an advertisement in the paper reading "Men Wanted." Of course he did not want to buy men outright, as folks used to buy chattel slaves. He hired some of you to work for him. He bought your human power, to work your labor power. And you sold him your labor power, just as a stockman sells horses or a baker sells bread. You went to the boss with something to sell. He was in the market to buy human labor power, and if your price was low you probably got a job. Some of us work many years before we realize that even we wage workers have one commodity to sell. As long as we are able to work we try to find a buyer of our labor power. We hunt for a job and the boss that goes with a job. Men and women who have no other means of support have to sell their labor power for wages in order to live. A commodity is something that satisfies some human want, something produced by labor power for sale or exchange. A dress made by a woman for herself is not a commodity. A dress made to be sold to somebody else is a commodity. It is not made for use, but for sale. Sheep are commodities, as are shoes, houses, gloves, bread, steam power and water power, when sold by one man to another. And your strength to make things, your human laboring power, or, as Marx says, your labor power, is also a commodity when sold to an employer for wages. Now you know that any man who is selling a commodity asks as high a price for it as he can. The little grocer who runs the small store near your home charges just as much as possible in selling butter to you. The coal dealers raise their prices whenever they can. And when you strike the boss for a job, you ask him as high a price for your labor power as you think you can get. High prices for labor power is what wage workers want. Low prices for labor power is what your employer wants. Are your interests identical? What happens when there are 10 men competing to sell their labor power? Who gets the job? What happens when there are several jobs and only one worker? Will he receive higher or lower wages? Will he get a good price for his labor power? When working men are scarce and manufacturers are forced to pay a high price for labor power, high wages, in a certain locality, does the scarcity of workers last long? If not, why not? When men are hunting jobs, toward which cities do they go? Why? Does supply and demand have anything to do with the price at which you are able to sell your labor power? Why is the Steel Trust putting up a $50 million plant in China? Will they be able to make more profits manufacturing steel there than in America? Why? Why do Chinese workmen come to America to sell their labor power? Karl Marx talks much of commodities, their value and their price, and in order to understand his teachings, we must know first of all that we are sellers of a commodity called labor power. In the next lesson we shall take up the question of what determines the value of your labor power and the value of all other commodities. We suggest that students buy and study Capital, by Marx, 3 vols, cloth, $2 each. Value, Price, and Profit, by Marx, 10 cents. These lessons are only an attempt to say, in the language of working men and women, the things Marx says in his own books. 2. The value of a commodity. In the preceding chapter, we learned that the wage worker's relation to the boss is that of a seller of a commodity. Whether you work in a minute, a mill or a factory, whenever you get a job you are selling your strength to work or your labor power to the boss. We know that labor power is a commodity like shoes or hats or stoves. Now all commodities are the product of labor, that is, there was never a commodity that was not the result of the strength and brains of working men or women. Workers make shoes, bakers of bread are working men or women, houses, streetcars, trains, palaces, bridges, stoves all are the product of the laboring man. All commodities are the product of labor. There is one common thing which all commodities contain. This is labor. A commodity only has value, exchange value, because it contains human labor. Horses are commodities, cows are commodities, gold is a commodity. Human labor has been spent in producing all these. Labor power is also a commodity, the result of human labor in the past. Working men and women spent labor producing you and me. Somebody made bread, sewed shoes, built houses and made clothes for us. All the things we ate and drank and wore and used were made by the labor of working men and women. Their labor was necessary labor. Without it we should never have grown old enough or strong enough to have labor power to sell. Labor power was spent in raising us to the point where we would be able to work. The value of a commodity is determined by the social labor time necessary to produce it. On page 61 of the current edition of Value, Price, and Profit, Marx says, "It might seem that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor bestowed upon its production, the lazier a man, or clumsier a man, the more valuable his commodity, because the greater the time of labor required for finishing the commodity. This, however, would be a sad mistake. You will recollect that I used the word social labor, and many points are involved in this qualification. In saying that the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor worked up or crystallized in it, we mean the quantity of labor necessary for its production in a given state of society, under certain social average conditions of production, with a given social average intensity, and average skill of labor employed. If you spend 3 months cutting up a log with a penknife into a kitchen chair, it will be no more valuable in the end than the kitchen chair made in the big factories where many men working at large machines produce hundreds of chairs in a single day. Of course we know that every new improvement in machinery lessens the labor time needed in making certain commodities. Oil is less valuable than it was 10 years ago because it takes less labor power to produce it. Steel has fallen in value, because owing to the new and improved machinery used in making steel it requires less human labor power for its production. Suppose every shoe factory in the country were working full-time in order to supply the demand for shoes. The factories using the very old-fashioned machinery would require more labor to the shoe than the factories using newer machines, while the great, up-to-date factories using the most modern machines would need comparatively little human labor power in producing shoes. The value of shoes would be determined by the average, or social, labor time necessary to make them, or the socially necessary labor contained in all the shoes. The value of gold or silver is determined in the same way. The necessary social labor needed to produce gold gives it its value. The value of gold rises or falls just as the value of other commodities rise or fall. Today gold is much lower in value than it was 20 years ago, because new methods of production have reduced the social labor needed in gold mining about 1/2. If you have $20 in gold, it is only of half the value of $20 20 years ago. It contains only half the labor. In the same way, we may determine the value of laboring power like every other commodity. Its value is determined by the quantity, or time, of labor necessary to produce it. The laboring power of a man exists only in his living individuality. A certain mass of necessaries must be consumed by a man to grow up and maintain his life. But the man, like the machine, will wear out, and must be replaced by another man. Besides the mass of necessaries required for his own maintenance, he wants another amount of necessaries to bring up a certain quota of children that are to replace him on the labor market and to perpetuate the race of laborers. It will be seen that the value of laboring power is determined by the value of the necessaries required to produce, develop, maintain and perpetuate the laboring power. Value, price, and profit, pages 75 to 76. The value of a man's labor power is determined by the social labor necessary to produce it, Marx says. This means food, clothing, shelter, the necessities of life, and it means something additional to rear a boy or girl to take your place in the shop or factory when you grow too old to keep up the fierce pace set by the boss. Enough to live on and to raise workers to take our places. This is the value of our labor power, if we are wage workers. Questions. What is a commodity? What does the wage worker sell to his employer? What determines the value of a commodity? What do you mean by social labor power? Are matches less valuable now than they were 10 years ago? Why? Have commodities in general decreased in value in the last 10 years of improved machine production? Why? Name commodities that have decreased in value. Has rubber increased in value? Why? Does it take less labor power to weave cloth, to make cement, to slaughter hogs than it did 20 years ago? Why? Remember that scarcity may cause a commodity to exchange, sell, above or below its value, but it does not make value. Marx says that value is human labor, in the abstract. Every class should have at least one set of Marx's Capital for reference in connection with these lessons. The table of contents in these 3 volumes is a splendid guide to students. Price, $2 a volume. For $6 sent us for 6 new review subscriptions, we will send the 3 volumes as premiums, prepaid expressage.